Hi, my name is Dr. Ryan Arthur. I coordinate learning development at Birkbeck College in the University of London. This video will explore aspects of stand-up comedy and relate them to our practice. So, why did I choose stand-up comedy as a vehicle to discuss our practice? I'm interested in the striking similarities between the stand-up comic and the educator. I'm also interested in the way the stand-up comic influences the audience's thinking at the gig and beyond the gig. Greenbaum suggests that the stand-up comic can only be successful when they convince an audience to look at the world through their unique comic vision. I'm interested in the way that stand-up comic engages in subversive and controversial forms of discourse. He or she functions as a lord of misrule. I'm also interested in the way stand-up comics put themselves at risk with every performance. Comics perform in the now. Every performance is never the same. Although the comic anticipates and plans for their response, the form of the response can never be assured. It can never be guaranteed. Scholars have described this as an ongoing negotiation process. Negotiations can break down at any time. The comics Keith Richards and Bill Burr are evidence of what can go wrong when walking this tightrope. Both comics lost control on stage. Each of their negotiations broke down, which led to their confrontation with the audience. Instead of the comic working with the audience, it was the comic versus the audience. Curiously, Bill Burr's confrontation catapulted him from obscurity to celebrity, but Keith Richards' confrontation resulted in his demise. He hasn't performed since. I'm interested in the way comedians revere and honor their craft. There is an understanding that their craft demands from them hard work, observation, trial and error, authenticity. I'm interested in the way comics can captivate the audience with just their bodies. No music, no script, no video, no pictures, no PowerPoint, just their presence. There is something so ancient about that, and keep the audience engaged for up to an hour, despite the distractions, food and alcohol, smart devices, yet the audience remains locked in with the performer. Ironically, what I'm not so interested in is the laughter, the humor. I feel no great urge to make students laugh. Laughter is a welcome byproduct of our teaching and learning, but it's not my core goal. This is where the stand-up comic and the educator part ways. Stand-up comedians often talk about finding the funny. This phrase always comes up, whereas we talk about finding the learning. We are both on the same journey, but comedians get off at the funny exit, and we get off at the learning exit. When we see students have that aha moment, you can see it in their faces when they get it. That is our version of laughter. This is what we try to find. I know this is extremely biased, but I believe that finding the learning is a much more virtuous and productive journey than just finding the funny. It seems like this sole aim to find the funny sometimes causes more problems than it solves. The analysis of stand-up comedy is shared by academics from a variety of subject areas: neuroscience, linguistics, politics, anthropology, just to name a few. Though I will draw from this literature, much of the materials in this session comes from stand-up comedians themselves. I feel that they are best placed to talk about their craft. Their insight is unmatched and resonates more than anything I have read in the available literature. Comedians are literally in the business of introspection. Emerson refers to them as autoethnographers. Even though there is no unifying voice of stand-up comedy, you would be surprised at the level of consensus and oft-repeated anecdotes that exist within that community. Riley discusses at length the community-based norms and even enforcement amongst stand-up comics. Also, scholars have observed that stand-up comedy relies on recognizable, reoccurring practices. In this session, we will set the scene by looking at the audience and the performer. Before we can even look at stand-up practices, it's vital to know who we are and who we are educating. The audience. Comedians often talk about the parable of the new comedian who talks to the back of the room. The parable resonated with my memories of lecturing for the first time. Traditionally, the older, more established comedians would sit at the back of the room, behind the audience. So the insecure and inexperienced new comedian would craft intricate jokes and flaunt his technical abilities to impress the established comedians at the back of the room. The new comedian was essentially performing to the back of the room, not the audience directly in front of him. It was as if he or she looked past the audience to their real target. In doing so, they sometimes confused the audience or lost the connection with the audience because the audience was not their central concern. Likewise, when I first started lecturing, I would create these overcomplicated and intricate lectures to impress my supervisor and module lead, all the while neglecting the actual class in front of me. I was talking to the back of the room, even though my supervisor and module lead may not have been in the room. I imagined that they were there. I really tried to fit into this image of a lecturer to the detriment of connecting to the students in front of me. However, after some years, the audience or the classroom becomes more prominent, and everything outside of the classroom fades to black. You now begin to see the audience. You see the students where they are, and you meet them where they are. Experience has taught me that this is something that requires continuous recalibration. I think we all recalibrate in this spectrum. At one end is the real audience. We fully acknowledge this audience in front of us. We try to see them as they are. We try to meet them as they are. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the imagined audience. I really love this phrase, the imagined audience. We imagine where the audience could be. We project onto the audience where we want to take them. They may not be there now, but we want to take them there. Working within this spectrum, if we lean too much towards meeting students where they are, we may give them what they want, not necessarily what they need. Comedians talk about this in terms of pandering, which is generally frowned upon. It is said that when we pander too much to the audience, the performer loses a part of himself or herself. At the other end of the spectrum, if we play to this imagined audience, we may lose the connection with the audience who is directly in front of us. So we teach across the spectrum, left and right, aware of the risk of veering too much to either side. Greenbaum referred to this as kairos. She compared stand-up comedy to rhetorical discourse. Kairos is an intuitive understanding of timing, adapting our discourse to meet the needs of the audience in real time. Situatedness. Even though we plan our session, we cannot anticipate every situational circumstance. We must carry a flexible attitude. This is kairos. Intuition. We need to make constant adjustments across this spectrum. An example of kairos for me is my recalibration from the offline audience to the online audience. In the physical classroom, I very much relied on group work. Students enjoyed working in groups. I enjoyed it. This formed the basis of my teaching. So naturally, I took this approach online by using breakout rooms. However, I did not see the same level of engagement and excitement that I experienced in the physical classroom. I tried changing the activity slightly. I tried to stir up engagement by jumping into each of the breakout rooms, but it felt forced and it still never achieved the same level of engagement as a physical classroom. But I kept on using breakout rooms, even though they did not work that well. I think the memories of students working in the physical classroom were clearer to me, were stronger to me than the present online audience on my screen. Imagined audience versus real audience. So I made a change. I exchanged the breakout room exercises for what I call town hall discussions. This is opening the floor so that we all have a discussion at the same time. This was the turning point for me. I once again experienced the same level of engagement that I experienced in a physical classroom. Keeping with this theme of interacting with the audience, it is important to think about our stage presence. Where do we position ourselves in relation to our students? I've always been curious about how we position ourselves in the classroom. A position that I see often is the stationary position, fixed in one place, sitting or standing behind the lectern. This is my spot. This is where I spend most of the lecture. I prefer to stand. I haven't tried sitting down yet. The anecdote said by comics is the new comic needs to stand up for many years before they get the right to sit down. Another position that I see is the walker, very energetic and enthusiastic, walking up and down the stage or the classroom. Moving on to our practice, I call this forward looking. When I finally get back to the physical classroom, this is what I really want to try. The educator stands or sits amongst the students, and they all discuss what is on the screen together. Everyone is facing forwards, looking at the screen. Students do not have to look at the educator or even look at each other. They are all critically staring at this object in front of them, together. Ferrari and Shaw refer to this as mutual inquiry. An object is placed on the table. Then students and educators look towards this object on the table together, and they discuss this object together. And as educators, we relearn what these objects are through looking at them with our students. Anecdotally, I can see the effectiveness of this forward-looking approach when I ask my eldest son directly, face to face, what is troubling him. He's not particularly forthcoming, but when we go for a walk, I find that he tells me much more. Maybe there is something about walking, both of us facing forward, not at each other, but looking forward. Perhaps he feels that he can release, and I relearn what it is to be a teenager nowadays. The last positioning is the circle. The educator sits in a circle with the students. This positioning attempts to dismantle hierarchy, decenter technology, and reaffirm the human aspect of teaching and learning. I've never tried this approach, but I'm very intrigued. Within learning development, I can see this being used for critical thinking, finding your voice, or perhaps ethical considerations around research. Not so much for the text-heavy sessions we do around paragraph structure and referencing. The performer. I ain't scared of you. This phrase was comic gold. It was said by an American stand-up comedian. He started his set with this statement, I ain't scared of you. Then throughout his set, he periodically tells the audience, I ain't scared of you. I thought this was hilarious at the time. But when I learned about the reason why he told the audience that he wasn't scared of them, I saw the genius of comedy. The backstory goes that the audience was very hostile and unruly. So before the comic was about to perform, he could hear the constant booing, the constant heckling from the audience. What scared him most was that the audience were booing well-established and popular comedians, much more popular than him. So the comedian complained to the host. He insisted that the host needed to do something. The audience was too unruly and he could not perform under these conditions. Then the host said something profound to him. If you can't handle it, you shouldn't be here. The comedian recalls these words. This is when he got the memo. This is when he understood what the assignment was. So the comedian adapted his material to suit the challenge. Kairos. That was Kairos. The first thing that he said on stage, I ain't scared of you. Then the audience erupted with laughter. He connected with the audience like no one did before. This was his origin story. Even though he had been doing stand-up for many years, this is where it all began for him. By going off script and recognizing the audience he had in front of him, he received a standing ovation. My origin story was from my time at SOAS in the University of London. I taught a module on economic development in the developing world. Towards the end of the module, a student questioned why I didn't refer to any scholars from the global south. Even though the module was focused on the developing world, all the scholars that I mentioned were European or American. Until she asked me that question. It was as if I was sleepwalking or an autopilot. I stuck to the script. I didn't question it. I just delivered it. I didn't even contemplate going off script or putting myself into my teaching. My origin story started there. I couldn't even respond to her question, but I got the memo and started to understand the assignment. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy this session